Thousands of Native American children were involuntarily removed from their families and adopted by non-Native Americans. To stop this assault, federal child placement legislation was passed in 1978. The Indian Child Welfare Act's goal is to ensure Indian children remain with Indian families. Today, thousands of black children are involuntarily removed from their families and adopted by non-blacks. Do we need federal legislation passed to preserve our heritage? Tune in to Fresh Start today on November 18th at 3 p.m. with the guest J. Tony Oliver, President of the National Association of Black Social Workers.
Start today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, and co-host is Sean Roby, and we're glad to be back here on this beautiful November afternoon. And we have a really important topic with some special guests who are going to be in the studio. We're going to be talking about does race matter in foster care placements and adoptions? You remember a couple of weeks ago we were talking and we started that conversation around transracial adoption. We kind of reviewed what the Adoption Safe Family Act was and MIPA, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, their impact on children being removed and adopted outside of the African-American community, and just what it's done in general to African-American families. So we're going to continue that dialogue today, and we have a special guest that's going to be calling in from the National Association of Black Social Workers, President J. Tony Oliver. J. Tony Oliver will be calling in, the president of the National Association of Black Social Workers. And then we also have Miss Solanda King James, who has a great story, and she will be sharing that with us a little bit later in the program. But first I want to say good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You know, in East African people, they have a tradition that whenever they meet folks out in the street or in the community or in business, wherever they might meet folks, they always begin their conversation by asking a question, a very important question. That question is Kasidia Injira. And do you know what Kasidia Injira means?
No, I don't.
You've never heard it before? Well, that basically means it's a question to ask, how are the children? And so typically the response will be for that person that you're engaged is Sapati Injira, which simply is the children are doing well. Because in that particular community, there is a value that's upheld that if children are doing well, then everybody's going to be doing well. So, Kasidi Injira. Sapati. Well, we're going to be talking, and again, we're waiting for our special guest, and in the interim, we're going to give you all a couple community announcements as it relates to child welfare. One is that the Milwaukee Partnership Council will be meeting this Friday, November the 20th, from 12 o'clock to 2 p.m. And as you all know, the Bureau of Milwaukee Child Welfare has changed their name to the Division of Milwaukee Child Protective Services. That meeting is going to be held at 635 North 26th Street in Milwaukee. And they have a couple of things that's on their agenda. Quality Parenting Milwaukee Initiative. The Health and Education Committee will be presenting with Chris Holmes as the chair. The Division of Milwaukee Child Protective Services Administrators Report. The interim administrator is Mary Pat Boone. And then we also have D.C. updates from the Secretary of the Department, Eloise Anderson. Legislative and other updates will be presented by Freddie Bove, who's the Administrator of Division of Safety and Permanence. And then we also have the Community Forum, which will be presented by Linda Davis, she'll oversee that portion. She is the chair of the Milwaukee Partnership Council. Again, that's this Friday, November the 20th, from 12 p.m. until 2 p.m. And the address is 635 North 26th Street. Then also New Horizon. New Horizon has been doing some great work in the Milwaukee area for the last 30 years, and they're going to be celebrating that milestone on December the 4th, 2004, which is a Friday evening. And so they have tickets available, silent auction, reception, dinner. Just a great, we definitely want to go over and celebrate with Mr. Salim El-Amin and all of his wonderful staff. You can contact Olivia El-Amin if you have more questions at 414-962-4000. They provide an array of services. They have foster care over there. They have a daycare. Matter of fact, I've sent some foster parents over to their daycare. They provide phenomenal services, as well as group homes. So again, give Olivia a call over at New Horizons, 962-4000. So we're talking about, does race matter in foster care placements and adoption? This is the National Adoption Awareness Month, for those who didn't know it, but also it is the National Native American Indian Heritage Month. So we're going to weave all of that into this conversation. This is going to be a great conversation. And if you would like to chime in, you can call 414-444-5250. 414-444-5250. Good afternoon, President Oliver.
Good afternoon.
Well, you know what? We are very pleased and honored to have you be a guest on Fresh Start today, talking about a very important topic, one in which I think you all are very familiar and well versed in. So thank you for weaving this time into your calendar, and we're looking forward to hearing what your position is as it relates particularly to about race and the impact of race in foster care and adoption placement, particularly around transracial adoptions. Again, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy to be able to be a part of your discussion.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. You all are doing great work over there at the National Association of Black Social Workers. How long have you all been in existence?
47 years.
47 years. Wow, congratulations. And
Thank you.
You all do a lot of great work. Can you talk a little bit about what your mission is over there, your values, your vision?
Well, actually, thinking about 47 years, I've been thinking about 50 years, actually, because we're getting ready, we're already beginning our planning for our 50th celebration in 2 more years. But you have to think about 47 years ago in 1968, what the climate was in the country. And one of them, it was a climate of protest. There was civil unrest. There was a lot of discussion and advocacy on equal rights. And a group of young black social workers were at a conference, at a national child welfare conference, as a matter of fact, and found that the workshops and the mission statements and the composition of the people in authority and in leadership they were not inclusive of the reality of the black experience. And it did not include people of African ancestry or African Americans in particular on their boards and their leadership arenas. And so they decided that on 10 demands that they were going to give to that particular organization in terms of inclusiveness. And at the end of those demands, they actually walked across the street. They were in San Francisco, walked across the street to Glide Memorial, which even today is very involved and has been in the forefront of civil disobedience, equal rights, and a number of very important issues around advocacy for people who are disenfranchised. And at Glide Memorial, they began to form what would become the National Association of Black Social Workers. So our mission has been to look at the issues that affect the African American community and to be inclusive in terms of having African Americans on all levels be able to speak for themselves about what is and is not effective and relevant to their life experience and the kinds of services that are being provided through the social service arena and the extent to which they are relevant to their needs or if they're excluded. So probably, one of the things that we're going to be looking at today that our organization is noted for is that in 1972, we developed a position paper that opposed transracial adoption. And that has been kind of a flagship position for our organization over these 47 years that when a lot of people think of us, they think of that position statement.
And what is that position exactly?
Well, let me talk about what it was in 72 and talk about what it is now.
Great.
So in 72, we were looking at the fact that African American families were interested in adoption and were being discriminated. They were not being allowed to adopt. And instead, agencies who did choose, which there were only a few, who were choosing to place African American children for the purpose of adoption, were basically seeking out white families. And so our position was that we were against transracial adoption in any form. And the reason was that the practice of placing transracially was really blaming the victim. It was saying that it was assuming that black children were hard to place, and it was also assuming that black families did not adopt. And neither one of those were true, and the research at that time that had been conducted by African American social researchers was proving it not to be true. The good thing about the position was that it made agencies put on the brakes and say maybe there's something that we need to do differently.
Right.
And during that period of time and the reflection and the mirror for these agencies, they began to look at ways that they could do a better job at recruiting black families. And there were a number of agencies then that came up with programs that were focused specifically on improving adoption outcomes for African American children with African American families. And what I will say is that in every place where there was a program like that, the outcomes for same-race placements were significant. And it really did prove the research to be correct, that the families were there, but they had been overlooked or they had been screened out of the process. Unfortunately, over the years, what happened is that people began to say, well, to prioritize same-race placements then is to discriminate against white people. Mm-hmm. So we need to get laws in place that say that placements cannot be made on the basis of race. So in the 80s, we had the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act to be enacted by the federal government, and agencies began to cease having the programs to recruit black families to be funded, and they were afraid to not place transracially. But the outcome since MIPA and all of the research has shown that MIPA has not been effective at placing black children. It has been effective at placing younger black children with white families, but it has not addressed the population of black children typically in foster care who are older children, siblings, and children with special needs. Those children still continue to languish in foster care. MIPA has done absolutely nothing for that. I can even say in my personal experience, in 1982, I started an agency here in the Atlanta area called Roots. And it was, I founded it so that there could be specific attention paid to the recruitment, preparation, and placement of African American families and elevating the need for adoptive families for black children in the Atlanta area. And we were very successful. On any given day, we were probably working with 100 families, and our placements were of school-age children, children in sibling groups of 2, 3, and more, and children who had developmental disabilities. And we were never without a pool of black families. And other agencies would say, well, what are you doing to find black families? And actually there was, on the one hand, I say there was nothing that we were doing, but on the other hand, I say that our approach to the community, our perspectives about the strengths of families had everything to do with how we viewed families and their capability to become effective resources for children. And word spread. And families were coming to us because they were getting served differently. They were being valued differently. They were not being screened out but screened in. We were helping families to develop more effective parenting skills, and they were leaving as very, very effective parents. And that's not to say that some did not disrupt, but the percentage of disruption was much smaller than what I had seen in other agencies over the years of my experience in the adoption arena.
Now, you talk about, your approach or the approach that your agency took to engage the African American community in the Atlanta area, and it produced a very positive response from the community. So do you think that, because one thing we know, especially according to the National Council of Disability and some other research bodies, they've shown that there's exposure bias and racial bias that is evident at every key decision point along the child welfare continuum, from reporting to investigation, substantiation, removal, provision of remedial services, foster care placement, and exiting care. Do you think that whatever the realities or experiences are of the individuals who are either the reporters or doing the assessment or the case managers that are reaching out to the community, that whatever their experience is, that they have the potential to bring that into their work, and that can cause some bias and some negative outcomes?
Most definitely. It's not just some bias. I mean, that, as far as I'm concerned, is the core.
It's the core.
You can't argue with the research, and I do know people who try to do that, but you are absolutely correct in your depiction of what the implicit bias that is at every stage of the decision-making process within the child welfare arena. And what we were finding is that there were children who were in care who should probably have never come into care
Mm-hmm.
if relative resources had been assessed appropriately, or if the relative resources had been given the kinds of supports that stranger resources would have received in order to be able to care for the children. We were fortunate that at the end of our existence, we had a kinship program, and we through that program, we probably placed, I think it was 600 children in about a 2 or 3 year period with relatives. And it wasn't that we had to find the relatives, it's that the relatives had to be assessed. So it was like the priority for assessment with these particular counties that we were partnering with was more on the, I guess they would call it the safety features. So they were more focused on child protective services than they were on reunification. Now, I can't say that the reason for that was funding, but what we typically see, if you look at federal funding, you will see that the further removed a child is from a family-like environment, the more money goes into that placement.
Right.
So you don't have you don't even have the funding source for in-home services, for services to children in their own homes that you have once that child is removed. Once that child is removed, 4E, it's called 4E funding, people who are outside of the system. It doesn't mean anything to them, but it's a whole different level of services and supports that is far greater in terms of the dollar amount than it would be if it was 4B services, that are the services that are typically fund in-home services to
Right.
children. So, it was always frustrating to me when I would go to national meetings and they would be talking about the new models and paradigms that were coming down the pike. And they would always start by the trigger for services was the child had to be removed from the home. And I couldn't start there. I said the trigger should be at the point that the child is determined to be at risk of abuse or neglect.
Okay.
And then the other piece, and that's very interesting because the perception of abuse and neglect oftentimes is the same technical definition as poverty. So if a child, is not being fed or clothed, or there's not heat in the house,
Or they smell, they came to school smelling.
Right. Is it because the parent wants them to be hungry? Or is it because the family unit in itself needs some different kinds of supports to be able to meet the needs of the family? So, but if you can only respond to that issue in terms of support services by removing the child, then you're going to remove the child.
Right.
And I've even heard in some situations where when we have opportunities to have what some call courageous conversations around race and culture and child welfare, that workers have said that when they were child protective service workers, who are the ones on the front end who have to go out and determine risk and determine whether a child should be removed, that at the point that they got the address that they were going to, it would determine whether they put the child's seat in the car. Oh. So it's almost like before you get there, you believe that you're going to be removing some children today.
But, in terms of reporting, we do know that national data shows that folks in the medical community and in the educational community report more in terms of make more reports of allegation abuse of African-American children versus Caucasian children. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at these biases, it's not just bias in the child welfare system, but it's bias in all of these government systems, and not just public hospitals, but private hospitals, not just public education or schools, but also in private education settings as well, that folks just perceive that black folks are more abusive
dangerous
and more neglectful of their children than Hispanics, than Caucasian. And the National Incident Study Report, all 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4, indicate that black families are not as abusive, more abusive than white families. And in the Incident Study 4 actually shows that that white families are more abusive under the same circumstances and conditions that African Americans are placed under, that they are more abusive and neglectful to their children. So when we're talking,
black children are removed more anyway.
And they're removed
Despite,
more. Right,
uh-huh.
and that's the issue there, in terms of why do you think that more black more black children are coming into the system?
Well, is that what we call implicit bias? It's being blinded by our perception of strengths or weaknesses or potential or possibilities.
Okay.
And if you believe, and unfortunately, and I don't have the answer to this, I wish I did, but if you believe that the best thing you can do, because in child welfare and in the helping profession, we're always looking at the best interest of somebody.
Right.
So if we believe that the best interest of the child is to be out of this environment, then our first step is going to be to take that child out. And I think that what happens is that it is so difficult to be able to peel back the layers of the onion and see where there are strengths in communities that don't have access to the kinds of resources that other communities have. And so if the parent didn't have access to formal education or middle-class type employment, then this is not the way the children should be raised. Rather than looking at what are the strengths in these communities, and certainly when you begin to understand value systems, I think of Robert Hill's back in the 70s, and then 25 years later he rewrote the book, Strengths of Black Families.
Right.
In 72, he was looking at the same population that Patrick Moynihan had looked at, and Patrick Moynihan said that the black family was headed to destruction and was dysfunctional and headed to destruction. And Robert Hill looked at the same population. Both of them were excellent researchers, and what he found were 5 strengths of black families that Moynihan would never have seen, because at some level, regardless, despite your skills at objective research, if you come in with a bias that some things always equal wrong or some things always equal right, then when you see it in your objective research, you put it on the wrong or right side based on your personal experience. So there's an extent to which being objective is compromised. The unfortunate piece is that most of the research and now what we hear, the evidence-based models, are developed from people who do not have a cultural experience, a diverse life experience, and so they're basing what these models should be of functioning, whether it's family functioning, child welfare functioning, whatever it is, on standards that apply to one group, and that group are white middle class standards.
Wow. Now,
excuse me, President Oliver, thank you for all of this very, very rich information, but I have one question. Do you think, or which one plays more of a role from your lenses, the experience that a case manager or an intake worker has, or the institutional programming that they receive?
Well, what takes over is the institutional programming, because the institutional programming is what sets the models that you use for risk assessment. It sets the determinants about what is risk. Most of the risk assessment models end up with a score. So the objective is to be objective. And so instead of looking at the family and saying, this child needs to be moved, then you ask certain questions and you score it on a grade of 1 to 5. When you get to the bottom, if your score is over a certain number, then that should indicate to you objectively that there's too much risk here to leave this child in this environment. Well, interestingly, I've had workers who have completed their risk model based on what it was asking, get to the score at the end, and it says that they're really in a bad shape and the child should be removed, and they've said out of their personal experience, they're not that bad, and they've gone back and changed some of the scores.
Wow.
So the models that we use oftentimes in trying to get to equality of services are biased in the questions.
Gotcha. What we want to do at this point, President Oliver, is take a break, and we're going to come back on the other side of the break. And I want you to kind of talk about what is the position of the National Association of Black Social Workers today as it relates to transracial adoption, and particularly asking the question whether or not you think that African American children should remain in the system if there is a white parent that is available to parent them. So,
okay, I'd love to.
Okay, sounds great.
Did you know that black children represent 67% of our local foster care community, according to the Department of Children and Families' most recent annual report? Many of these children are not only removed from their parents and siblings, but are placed in families, schools, and neighborhoods that do not reflect or honor their race, culture, or heritage. I was talking to some children who are in foster care the other day, and they said this traumatic experience often leaves them feeling sad, scared, and lonely. Black children and youth do matter. You can help the most vulnerable population of children in our community by becoming a licensed, culturally responsible foster parent with Fresh Start Family Services. To join our foster family, you must be 21 years of age, have a stable income, married or single, clear several background checks, complete 36 hours of pre-licensing training, and have a loving heart. To learn more about other qualifications, call 414-351-1100. That's 414-351-1100. Foster the future. Foster a child.
You're listening to Fresh Start Today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, with co-host Sean Roby. We have on the phone line with us today the president of the National Association of Black Social Workers, J. Tony Oliver, and our special in-studio guest is Miss Salonda King James. And so we're talking about, does race matter in foster care, placement, and adoption? This is National Adoption Month in America. And so some of the things that we know is that black children enter the foster care system at an alarming rate and are more likely to stay in the system longer and least likely to be adopted. Mm-hmm. We also know that foster care constitutes the core of child welfare of the child welfare system, rather than supportive or supplemental services being provided in-house with that birth family. We also know that it's less expensive to keep children in their homes or families of origin than it is to remove them and place them into the system. And so we have on the phone line, we have JT. JT, do you have a brief question or comment before President Oliver chimes in? JT.
Hello?
Yes, JT, you have a brief question.
Hey,
how you doing, my friend? You know it's just not right if JT don't call.
JT.
Well, you have a question or brief comment, JT?
Yes, I do, sir.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for accepting my call, and thank you for the work you do, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you for your guests.
Yes.
The only issue I want to say about everything you were saying today, like you always do, I know one thing when it comes to placement for young black kids.
Yes.
All of a sudden find themselves in a situation where they have to be adopted or sent off. What get my goat is when you have grandparents that have been raising the kids anyway, and if their kids mess up and end up into the penal system and the court system take away the kids, they automatically give them to white people. Now, excuse me for being for real about that now. I'm not trying to be biased or anything. I'm just, like you, trying to tell the truth about it. What happened to these young black kids, babies, teenagers, or whatever the case may be, when they take it away from their families because their parents did something wrong, that's traumatic to them, okay? And now, what you said earlier, what happened to them? Well, you can send them up north. You can give a black baby to two white men up north somewhere, okay? Check that out. Or you can give them to a white family, okay? But the fact is, like you were saying earlier, you're taking these children away from their
community, their families.
And their community and their families. That's very traumatic.
All right. Thanks a lot, JT. So do you think that in the black community that in general that we have a problem with black children being removed or cared for by non-blacks and particularly whites?
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks a lot, JT.
That's because of the system, sir.
All right.
Excuse me. Hold on for a second. That's because obviously there's a lot of black parents that want to take on watching out for their kids. What pisses me off is that you have grandparents and uncles and nieces, whoever in the family
Who could be possible placement options if provided the supports and same supports that non-relative caregivers are receiving?
Non-caregivers or anybody like that want to take on that.
Gotcha. All right, JT.
Duty.
I got to get back to my guest.
What I'm trying to say, sir, you have people out there that take care of their family anyway, but they don't get compensated for it.
There you go. That's a very powerful point. Thanks a lot, JT. You have a great afternoon and week.
And thank you, sir.
President Oliver, you still there?
I am.
Well, thank you for your patience. And so I want to kind of talk to you, because when you all released that position statement back in 1972, I believe it was your president then, William T. Merritt. And
Yes.
basically, if I can quote that, he said, transracial adoption of an African-American child should only be considered after documented evidence of unsuccessful same-race placements has been reviewed and supported by appropriate representatives of the African-American community. I thought that was really powerful. But it went on to say, too, that they view placement of black children in white homes as a hostile act against our community. In fact, it went on to say that they believe that it rose to the level of racial and cultural genocide. After you all released that statement in 72, something happened. Congress, the Native American community, Indian community, they began to oppose the removal of a number of thousands of their children being removed from their reservation and tribal communities. And Congress was able to see that there was an intrinsic value in keeping Native American children in their communities with their families. And then they passed the National Indian Child Welfare Act, which was to ensure that Native American children remain with Native American families and communities. Do you think that when African American children are in the system and there are Caucasians or some other non-African person that's available to care for them, do you think that is acceptable? And what is your position today, the national position today, on transracial adoptions?
Okay, so you've asked a lot of questions, but I want to go back to, I think it was JT?
Yes.
When he was talking about the availability and the willingness of grandparents and other relatives to be caretakers for children who were removed out of the system. And he is so correct, and that's a part of our position that has developed itself since 1972. At the point that, I was listening while we were on break to the area that you're in, and one of the statements that was being made is that 67% of the children in foster care are African American. And I know that 67% of the children between 0 and 18 in the area that you live, in the general population, is not African American. And so that's a problem. That's what disproportionality is all about. When children are coming out of, and typically it's out of certain zip codes, into the child welfare system at alarming rates, there's something wrong with the removal decision-making process. And I would guess that many of those in that 67% have grandparents, aunts, uncles, even friends, people in the church community who would be more than willing to step up to the plate and take these children in on a permanent or a temporary basis. The same way strangers are provided the opportunities and resources. But as JT indicated, in most instances now, for the relatives, there are no resources, and those relatives themselves may already have needs that need to be addressed. It may be health needs, it may be employment, it may be housing that are available on some level to other people in the community, but not readily available to people in the family who want to take on. And they're not taking on one child. They're taking typically a sibling group of children in. And so, our agencies need to begin to look at the extent to which their practices demonstrate institutional racism. What happens differently for black children in the system that happens for white children? And most agencies will say at the administrative level, we treat all children the same.
And that's not true.
Well, there's a problem right there, because the experiences of all children are not the same. So if you say that I'm going to treat you just like I treat anybody else, but you're coming in at a handicap in terms of resources and capabilities, then you will never win, and you will always lose. So what our position is at this point is that we recognize that disproportionality exists across the country.
Yes.
And we also recognize that because of that, it would probably take almost every black person in the country to be able to take in the children black children as fast as they come out. So in some ways our position is still the same, because if you look at the 1972 position, we were saying first, this position has always been focused on family preservation. The piece that has been talked about most is transracial adoption. But our position was then and is now that when a child is in crisis, that the first thing that needs to happen is that family system needs to have what we would call today wraparound services to be able to provide the kinds of supports that would enable a child to stay in the home. If the child cannot stay in the home, then the first placement of choice would be with relatives, and those relatives should be assessed, and they should also be provided the kinds of support services that would be needed in order for them to parent effectively. If that couldn't happen, then the third option would be placement of a child with a person of their own race. Now, some people then begin to play the devil's advocate at that point and say, you would just place a child with any old black family. That is not what we said. And there's nothing that NABSW has ever said that would even suggest that there should not be an assessment and preparation process to make sure that placements are made with same-race placements who can meet the needs of a child.
Okay.
Now, where we have gone further is to say, if the instance that all of the first three cannot happen, and the decision has been made, and I say that taking a breath, the decision has been made to terminate parental rights, because I think that's done too often
and too quick,
as well, and too quickly. But if the decision has been made for transracial adoption and there is a family of a different race, then a decision must be made to prepare that family so that they understand, appreciate, and recognize the impact of race and racism on their family and the life of that child. Unfortunately, what happens is when white families come to the table to adopt black kids, we're afraid to have the conversation about race, and some agencies don't allow you to have the conversation about race. And so what they want to hear from the family is something like race doesn't matter. Well, that's the craziest thing that anyone has heard, because you have to be blind, deaf, and dumb to not recognize that there are many things that happen differently because of race and racism.
Well, let me ask you something right there with race and racism, and we're looking at the legislation and the state departments that really oversee, and even on county levels, government that oversees the operation of foster care and adoption in this country. And given the number of African-American children, do you think that folks who run and govern child welfare in America, that they are aware that race does matter, but because it's black children that we place a lower value on black life?
I think that most of them haven't even gone that far. I think that they, number one, are afraid to have the conversation.
Okay.
And then second, in being afraid to have the conversation, they do deny that it exists. They're in denial.
They're in denial.
And so there is nothing in their service interventions that would even require that their staff is trained to be able to have conversations with families around race. I did a what do you call it, focus group. There were some focus groups that we facilitated a couple of years ago in ABSW around families parenting African-American males and the kinds of services that they felt as though they needed. And clearly, in every instance, the families that said they would really welcome some type of support, and these were foster and adoptive families, they would welcome some kind of support and intervention from their agency on what is necessary to develop a positive racial image and self-concept, a positive self-concept image in black boys. And they had to kind of find it on their own through their friends network. There was nothing in their agency that would be able to help them in that. Nothing available. Nowhere to go.
You know,
and
and
so
I
when
think
we talk now, that's really scary because when we talk about outcomes for black boys in general, we know that that population in particular is very vulnerable to negative outcomes.
Right.
And so you really need to put in more for families in terms of preparation to enable black boys to develop a sense of self-esteem, positive self-concept, and a positive racial concept, and to understand how to be safe. And see, that then we come to this other issue in terms of transracial adoption. White families who don't have a racial orientation and cannot, because they were not raised in a different race, then don't have the innate abilities to be able to say to their sons or daughters who are African American, these are the kinds of experiences that you're going to have just because of your race. And these are some of the things that you're going to have to do in order to be safe. When the research looks at white parenting and black parenting of black children, what they find is that black parents talk to their children about race almost on a daily basis. And white parents don't, because they don't want it to be, they say they don't want it to become an issue, and they want their children to look at themselves as a part of the human race.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let me say this, because I know we're getting toward the end of this interview, and this has been a very rich conversation, as Mr. Roby indicated. But I have two questions. First, I want to make a statement that there are a number of well-meaning, dedicated foster parents, adoptive parents, and case managers who are not African American, who work, who are dedicated to helping work in the best interest of children, families. I've ran across them, I've employed them, and I applaud them for the work they do, because I know it may not always be a comfortable position, and they probably don't get a lot of recognition. But there's definitely a need for child welfare reform, and for us to approach this issue of race, white privilege, racism, power, all of these things that exist in our child welfare community that is having a very negative impact on the black family and the black community. The question that I have for you is, what about those black folks who work within this system, this culture, this environment? What responsibility do we have to other black children, to our black children who are in this system, in terms of advocacy, in terms of protecting them? What is our responsibility?
We have a huge responsibility, and that's a whole nother show almost, because we have to begin to ask ourselves the question about why don't we speak up? Why do we accept things that we know are wrong? Some of it has to do with our own life experience with racism, that, we don't matter. How we feel doesn't matter. Even feeling uncomfortable when the larger community says to us, you're always playing the race card. And so you don't want to bring it up because, you even begin to question yourself. Is it me who's super sensitive, or would this happen differently if the actors were white? And so we've learned certain things that are not always in our best interest about coping skills, about what you can say to whom, what you just have to let go because it's going to happen, and our belief in how much power do we have.
Gotcha. I have a guest here in the studio. Her name is Salonda King James, and Salonda, introduce yourself.
Hello, yes, I am Salonda King James, and I am a sibling of 7.
Okay.
And we had quite a bit of experience on being in and out of the system.
The foster care system?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And due to my mom had been on substance abuse, or a lack of neglect, not being there, not providing, and just leaving the home unprotected.
How many years were you in the system?
Anywhere between the years of maybe 4 to 7 years.
4 to 7 years. And were you placed in one home, or did you live in
always a different home?
Always a different home.
Always a different home.
Now, you're African American. Did you live in all African American, or were you placed in all African American homes within the African American community, or were you placed in other communities and parented by other individuals?
It was always short term, but we were with some blacks, we were with white. We were with white families, black families, Hispanic families.
And did you see that there was a difference between how you were parented in those different communities or those different families, ethnic families?
Absolutely, absolutely. I I think motive plays a big part in it. I didn't see any love when I got to the black foster care parents.
So you were in a number of black foster homes.
Yes,
And
a number.
And you didn't feel that you
majority.
were loved and accepted in black foster homes. But you were saying the other day that you were placed with a relative at one point.
Yeah.
And I think this was a very powerful piece. That there was a particular relative who had introduced you as their foster daughter.
Absolutely.
And that was just like,
It was very uncomfortable. It was very embarrassing. He was my uncle. He was my mother's younger brother. He took us in because when they separated us, they could not place the older three. They were only able to place.
and we
the
see that
younger
happen a
four.
lot too, where when you have large sibling groups that you can't place them all in one home. So President Oliver, there's something that she was talking about, this relative, and then being, African Americans who are licensed to provide foster care services. I was just talking about what our responsibility from maybe service provider standpoint, case managers, child welfare administrators, what is our responsibility to these children, our children who are placed in this situation. But when we have situations where it appears that we're motivated by money, how do we address that piece? And when family members take in their relative children and they treat them differently, how do we get over that and deal with that?
Well, it's a couple of issues. One is, how do we and I hate to put it this way, but do we just take anything when we're looking for a black home?
Okay.
And one of the things that my agency did for foster care and adoption is that everybody wasn't approved. So it's not just you want hots in a cot. You want
Quality.
You want somebody who's going to be able to meet the needs of the child. And so first of all, they have to understand the needs of a child. And I don't know, I can't say what types of preparation and supervision and support are provided to these families that would allow them to give the kinds of services that are should not be allowed. Some homes need to be closed. Many homes need to be closed.
Absolutely.
So that's another thing with it's not that, and I would hope that it's Yolanda, right?
Salonda.
Mm-hmm. I would hope that your experience wouldn't lead you to believe that there's something wrong with black people. And that because at some point what we do is we as black people do that. And we begin to say things are better with other communities and other services and other businesses than they are with blacks because of bad experiences that we've had. What I think that we need to do is we need to hold agencies accountable for the quality of services and the type of supervision and preparation and training and oversight that they give to the families that they entrust children with. Because and your experience is not isolated, but I have seen too often where children have been removed from neglectful parents and placed with abusive parents. Wow. And those parents got services and so-called supports to inflict abuse on children. So that's an agency problem.
Okay.
And an agency responsibility. And the people who allow that to happen in agencies are the ones that need to be called on the carpet.
Got you. Quick question for you, President Oliver, and I guess for Ms. James King as well, King James as well, is what do you believe are the most important factors when placing children in foster homes and or looking for adoptive parents? What are some things that your agency, President Oliver, looked at? And then also, too, Salon, with you having been in the system, what do you think some things that we as an agency and as the department need to be looking at when we're searching for homes? President Oliver?
Well, one of the things that we always did was to try to help the families to walk in the shoes of the child. What does it feel like to be removed from your family based on whatever situations that might have occurred, whether it was substance abuse or even if it was sexual abuse or if it was physical abuse or if it was neglect. There wasn't enough money in the home to be able to provide heat and food and clothing, and there just wasn't the care. The children were allowed to roam freely. What would it feel like as a child to be in that situation, and then what would that child need from a parent who was taking them in to be able to help them deal with what had happened to them and to be able to feel safe? Now, some families selected out because they didn't want those quote-unquote problems. But there were other families who recognized that this is not, a softy, feely kind of experience. This is a job. And so I'm coming in as a professional parent. I want to make a difference in the life of a child. I want to help a child to heal from the past and to be able to reunify if necessary, which would mean to work with that biological family, because if there was a partnership there, that foster family should also be able to help heal the birth family. So it sounded like when they were placed with the birth family, there was no support or training on the birth family side, but just, the plan is to reunify, and here's somebody we can reunify with, and we're not going to have them to go through what we would go through if they were a stranger family. But everybody can benefit from effective parenting training.
Correct.
To be able to understand the needs of children. Even people with birth families whose children don't come into foster care need to go through some type of parent preparation training, because we parent based on how we were parented, and that does not necessarily mean it's going to meet the needs of every child in your home.
That's true.
So what do you think are some things the qualities that we need to be looking for when placing children with adoptive and or foster homes?
Looking at true motive and safety concerning the child. Looking at, I totally agree with her on, we do need to provide more training. We need to provide more training because mental abuse is not always discussed in our culture, to my understanding. It's easily misunderstood. It's easily overlooked. We should provide more training for families, for parenting, for foster care parents, as it relates to, what's the best need for that child.
If I can chime in, I think from working in child welfare, I think there would be an added value if there were some diligent recruitment efforts of African American administrators, those who have the power to make decisions. Including those who are on the front line, because I think that child welfare should reflect or look like the population that is served, that is being served. And I don't want to insinuate or to suggest that just because you are African American mean that you are culturally competent.
Right.
That's true.
Now, that was one of the things I loved about my agency, is because the majority of the families that we were preparing were African American. And so when we got into preparing families to be effective, potential families to be effective foster and adoptive families, we had to talk about how we were raised and what messages there were in those kinds of techniques toward parenting, and what those same techniques, if we decided that we were going to use them, could mean on a child who had been abused, neglected, or abandoned.
Right.
And they, their eyes were wide open, because to understand, to be able to connect the dots like that, we don't have an opportunity in our community to talk about, to get on that level about how we were raised, what harm there may be in some of our techniques, what kinds of messages do we need to provide to children, what information are we getting from children that we need to take heed to in order to be able to develop them to be the best that they can be. It was just a wonderful experience, and we had families who had sometimes decided, somewhere it was a 10-session program, they might have decided at meeting 4 that this was not what they were going to do because of what it was going to demand of them, but they didn't leave the class because they felt like they were getting so much out of it personally.
Now, we have about 2 minutes left, and I just want to say this. This is my disclaimer. I am invoking my First Amendment right to the freedom of speech that's recorded in the Constitution of the United States of America. And I don't expect any retaliation or censorship from the local government. So I just want to put that out there. I am a citizen. But I have a question for you, and I want you to close us out, and we'll be back next week on Fresh Start Today. But President Oliver, I'm thinking about the Indian Child Welfare Act, and you all were very influential in getting that passed because they really looked at the work that you all were doing, and Congress passed that. Why do you think that Congress didn't pass the national, what do you call it, the National
Heritage Act.
African American Heritage Act. Yes, Child Welfare Act. So why didn't they pass that? Because
what I've been told is that they referenced or understood the Native Americans to be a sovereign nation.
Okay.
And that we didn't have land, or we couldn't, identify things that had been taken from us as they had been taken from Native Americans. And one of the other things they said as they went forward is that they couldn't identify a culture that would be clearly connected to being an African American. But I will say that for some years there was an act in Minnesota that was the African American Heritage Act. So in one place it was enacted, but it was also overturned later.
Wow. So, but thank you. And I think we should have a conversation in terms of what needs to be done or what possibly be done now that you have more black folks in legislation. Do we need to make this a concern among the black community about getting the National African American Heritage Child Welfare Act passed, contacting our legislators, saying this is a real serious issue due to the number of African American children who are involuntarily removed from our homes and our communities, just like the Native American. Thank you for tuning in to Fresh Start today. It's been great. We look forward to seeing you on next week. Be safe and be well.